She said it to me almost every single day for 2 years, standing in front of a refrigerator in a house I helped pay the down payment on. This food is mine, not yours. My daughter, the one everybody in this family called a failure, never said it to me once. Not one single time in the 2 years my own son let his wife decide whether I got to eat. I'm 67 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. It's a story about which one of your children lets you go hungry under their roof, and which one drives 40 minutes with a trunk full of food and never once makes you feel like you owe them for it. Let me back up. I live outside Dayton, Ohio, in a house that isn't mine. It belongs to my son Bradley and his wife Vanessa, a two-story colonial in a subdivision with a name like Wexford Meadows, the kind of house with a pantry the size of my old bedroom and a refrigerator that beeps at you if you leave the door open too long. I have a room upstairs at the end of the hall, past the guest bathroom nobody ever lets me use because Vanessa keeps the good towels in there for company. The room has a nice bed and a window that looks out over a golf course I never play anymore, not since my knees gave out. I want you to hold that image in your head because it matters for what comes next. A man with a nice bed in a house full of food, going to sleep hungry more nights than I'd ever admit to anybody but you. It started small, the way most of these things do. A sticky note on a container of leftover chicken. Vanessa's, don't touch. Then a lock, an actual small combination lock on the pantry door, the kind you'd put on a gym locker, installed on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at a doctor's appointment. No conversation about it beforehand, no explanation after. Then the words themselves, the ones I heard so many times over 2 years I could say them in my sleep, in her exact clipped tone, the one she uses for people she's decided don't quite belong in a room. This food is mine. If you want something specific, make a list and I'll add it to my order. I made lists. God help me, I made lists like a child asking permission for a snack. At 67 years old, in a house I'd put $11,000 toward buying. Welcome to Brian's revenge. If this story's already got a knot in your stomach, that's exactly where I need you. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and stay with me. Because what I found in a filing cabinet 14 months into living in that house changed every single thing about who was going to end up with a key to that pantry. 3 years ago, I still had my own house, a little 3-bedroom over on Fora Boulevard that my wife Alina and I bought the year Bradley was born. Alina worked 31 years as a school administrator over in Kettering, good pension, the kind of steady life that felt like it would hold forever right up until the week it didn't. She died of a stroke in that house, sitting in her chair by the window grading a stack of attendance reports out of habit even after she'd retired, and I found her there when I came in from the garage. I was 64 years old and a widower inside of one Tuesday evening, and I want to tell you that grief alone nearly took the house from me, except it wasn't grief that did it. It was a reverse mortgage company that a woman named Alina had never fully trusted, but that I, in my worst and most exhausted year, signed papers for anyway, because a smiling agent at my kitchen table told me it would give me breathing room in retirement, and I didn't have the strength left that year to read every line the way Alina always had. I remember that agent's name still, Mr. Callahan. Remember the way he'd set a folder of paperwork on my kitchen table, the same table where Alina used to grade papers every Sunday evening, and talk to me in a warm, patient voice about how a reverse mortgage would simply let me draw against equity I'd already earned. No monthly payments to worry about. Nothing due until I sold the house or passed away myself. He didn't linger long on the parts about occupancy requirements, about what would happen if I ever spent an extended stretch away from the property, about how quickly a loan like that could come due if certain boxes weren't checked in certain windows of time. I signed where he told me to sign, 3 separate times over 2 visits, grateful in a numb, grieving way for anybody who seemed to have a plan for what came next, because I certainly didn't have one of my own that year. 2 years after Alina passed, the loan came due in a way I hadn't understood it could. Some clause about the home no longer being my sole primary residence after I'd spent an extended stretch at my brother's during a bad bout of pneumonia that had turned into something closer to a small stroke of my own. Weeks in a hospital bed, followed by weeks more in my brother's spare room recovering strength I didn't know I'd lost. The company moved to foreclose faster than I could find a lawyer willing to fight it for what little equity was left, faster than I could even fully understand what was happening to me. I remember sitting across a desk from a very young loan servicing representative who kept using the phrase acceleration clause like it should mean something to me. And I remember driving home from that meeting with both hands shaking on the wheel, already knowing, somewhere underneath the disbelief, that the house was gone before anybody had said the actual words out loud. I lost the Fora Boulevard house 11 months after I lost Alina. Sold what furniture wouldn't fit anywhere else. Gave away the garden tools to a neighbor's teenage son who'd always admired them. And stood in that empty living room one last time before handing over the keys, thinking about 31 years of Sunday evenings, and a woman who would have read every single line of that reverse mortgage paperwork before she ever let me sign a single page of it. I want you to sit with that, because it's the reason I ended up in a room at the end of a hallway in a house that belonged to somebody else, at an age when I should have been settling in, not starting over. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments which one of my children you think opened their door first, because I promise you, it is not the one everybody in this family expected. Bradley offered me the room the week the foreclosure finalized, and I remember being so grateful I cried in his driveway before I'd even carried in my first box. He's my successful one, the one who made regional manager at a logistics firm by 34. The one Vanessa likes to mention has a company car and a bonus structure most of her friends' husbands don't have. My daughter Patricia, the one everybody in this family has spent a decade calling the failure, the one who works the front desk at a dental office and has been renting the same one-bedroom apartment for 6 years because saving for a deposit on anything bigger has never once been within reach. Patricia offered me her own bedroom the same week, told me she'd sleep on the pullout in her living room for as long as I needed. I chose Bradley's house. I want to be honest with you about that because it matters. I chose the bigger house, the nicer room, the son everybody at church already assumed was taking care of his widowed father, because some old, foolish part of me still believed that a house that looked like it had more to offer would actually offer more. I found out inside of 6 months exactly how wrong that assumption was. Vanessa was polite that first year, in the careful, distant way you're polite to somebody you've already decided is temporary. She made a show of it at first, an extra place setting, a comment to her book club friends about how lovely it was to have Bradley's father close by, a framed photo of the three of us she put up in the front hallway the week I moved in, taken down again. I noticed, sometime around the 8-month mark, replaced with a print of a lighthouse she'd bought at a home decor store. The lock on the pantry didn't go up until year 2, right around the time Bradley got passed over for promotion he'd been counting on, a regional director position that went instead to a younger man with an MBA Bradley didn't have. And I watched something in that house tighten after that. Some belt cinched a notch further, though the tightening never once touched anything Vanessa herself seemed to want. New patio furniture appeared that same spring. A membership to a golf club neither of them, used more than a handful of times a year, got renewed without discussion. But the grocery budget, apparently, needed better structure, and the structure that got chosen was a small combination lock on a pantry door, installed on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at a doctor's appointment. No conversation about it beforehand, no explanation after, just a new obstacle waiting for me when I got home. 4 numbers I was never. I started noticing Vanessa doing math out loud at the grocery store on the rare occasions she still let me come along, wondering aloud whether feeding one more mouth was really sustainable on a single income while her own credit card statements, which I wasn't supposed to see but did, once, left open on the kitchen counter next to a laptop she'd stepped away from, told a very different story about where the actual money in that house was going. A resort weekend with her. A designer handbag I recognized from a display case at the mall. $300 at a spa in a single afternoon. None of that, apparently. Strange shared resources the way a 67-year-old man's groceries did. I want to be fair here, because fairness has always mattered to me even when it wasn't offered back. Bradley wasn't cruel to my face, not in the way you'd picture a villain being cruel. He was something quieter and in its own way worse. He was absent in the exact moments that mattered most, present enough to nod at me in a hallway, absent enough to never once ask his wife why there was a lock on a pantry in the house his own father lived in. I used to lie awake some nights trying to decide which was worse, a man who takes food from his father's hands, or a man who simply lets it happen and calls his silence keeping the peace. The malnutrition crept up on me slower than you'd think, the way most quiet. I was skipping the second half of meals to make what I was allotted stretch further, telling myself I'd simply lost my appetite the way older men sometimes do, telling Bradley I was fine every single time he asked, which by that second year wasn't often. I dropped 19 pounds over about 5 months without meaning to, and I noticed my belt cinching 2 extra notches before I let myself admit anything was actually wrong. It was a Tuesday in March when I fainted in that upstairs hallway, right outside the guest bathroom with the good towels I wasn't allowed to use, and cracked my hip against the corner of a hallway table hard enough that Bradley heard it from downstairs and came up 2 steps at a time. I remember the ceiling light spinning above me, and I remember Vanessa's voice somewhere behind him, not asking if I was hurt, asking instead, in a tone I'll never forget as long as I live, whether I'd been taking my vitamins like she'd suggested. The ER doctor, a kind, tired young woman named Dr. Osai, ran blood work and looked at my chart for a long moment before she sat down across from me instead of standing over the bed. "Mr. Whitfield, your labs show significant low protein, low potassium, markers that tell me this has been going on for a while, not days. Has something been going on at home that's affecting how much you're able to eat?" I looked at Bradley, standing there in the doorway of that curtained-off ER bay, and I couldn't make myself say it out loud in front of him. I said I'd probably just been careless about meals since Alina passed. "Doctor." Osai didn't fully believe me. I could see it in her face, but she let it go, the way people do when the truth in a room is too heavy for anybody to lift in front of family. She did ask me one more question before she left the room, waiting until Bradley had stepped out to take a call, her voice dropping low and gentle. "Mr. Whitfield, is anyone keeping food from you at home? I need to ask, and you're allowed to tell me the truth here, it's just the 2 of us. I want you to know that." I sat there on that hospital bed with an Roman 4 taped into the back of my hand, and came closer than I'd come in 14 months to saying the whole ugly truth of it out loud to somebody with the authority to actually do something about it. But some old, stubborn piece of pride, the same piece that had made me sign that reverse mortgage without reading every line, the same piece that had made me choose the bigger house over my daughter's pull-out couch, kept the words locked behind my teeth. "I'm just getting older," I told her instead. "Losing my appetite, the way it happens sometimes." She wrote something in my chart I couldn't see and didn't push further, but she pressed a small card into my hand on her way out, a number for a social worker who specialized in elder welfare, and told me to call it any time, day or night, no judgment attached. I kept that card in my nightstand drawer for months afterward, underneath a folded photograph of Alina, and I want to be honest with you. There were nights I took it out and just held it in my hand without dialing, not yet ready to turn my own family into a phone call to a stranger. Bradley came back in a few minutes later, phone still in his hand, and asked the nurse how much longer the workup would take, whether we'd likely be discharged that same night or admitted for. Not one question about what Dr. Osai and I had discussed while he was in the hallway. Not one question about whether I was frightened, lying there with a needle in my hand and a chart full of numbers that told a story I still wasn't ready to say out loud myself. If you're still with me, that tells me something about the kind of person you are. And I think you're going to want to see what happened when Bradley finally had to explain that hospital bill to his wife. Because it wasn't the tenderness you'd hope for from a man watching his own father nearly collapse from hunger in his house. I stayed 2 nights in that hospital for observation, and a hip that turned out to be badly bruised but not broken. More luck than I deserved at my age. Patricia came the first night and didn't leave. Slept sideways in a vinyl recliner chair with her coat as a blanket. Held my hand through most of it the same steady way she's held things together her whole life, without anybody once thanking her properly for it. Bradley came the second evening, stayed 40 minutes, spent half of it on the phone in the hallway with Vanessa about something to do with the cape, and I heard just enough of that call through the door to understand exactly where his attention actually lived. When I was discharged, Vanessa didn't come to pick me up. Bradley did, quiet the whole ride, and when we got back to the house he sat me down at the kitchen table and told me, in the gentlest voice he could apparently manage for something this ugly, that Vanessa felt the household budget needed, quote, better structure going forward, that maybe it would be healthier for everybody if I contributed toward groceries directly instead of, and I remember this phrase exactly, straining shared resources. I don't have anything to contribute. You know that. The house on Fora Boulevard is gone. My social security barely covers my medications. Then maybe, he said, not quite meeting my eyes, Patricia could help out more with that kind of thing. She doesn't have the same expenses we do. Patricia doesn't have the same expenses because Patricia doesn't have your house, your car, or your bonus structure. I wanted to say, and didn't, because by then I'd learned that saying true things out loud in that kitchen never once changed anything. It only ever made the silence afterward colder. I called Patricia that same night, ashamed to even be making the call, ashamed the way you only get ashamed asking your youngest child, the one everybody spent years treating like she owes the family an apology for renting a 1-bedroom apartment, to help feed her own father in her brother's 5-bedroom house. Dad, stop, she said, before I'd even finished getting the sentence out straight. I'm coming Thursday like always. I'm bringing enough for 2 weeks this time. No. Don't argue with me, Patricia, I can't ask you to, you're not asking. I'm telling you, she was quiet a second. I should have been doing more all along, Dad. I just didn't want to make it seem like I was saying something bad about Bradley's house. I don't want to say it now either, but I'm not doing that anymore. Thursday, 2 weeks worth. That's it, that's final. She showed up that Thursday with 6 full grocery bags, things she'd clearly budgeted hard for, the generic label items mixed in carefully with a few of my actual favorites. A jar of the fig preserves I love that cost more than she should have spent, tucked in like she hoped I wouldn't notice the extravagance of it. She hauled it all up to my room herself, past the pantry with its gym locker combination lock, and stacked a little shelf of it in the corner by my window, my own small pantry inside somebody else's house. This is yours, Dad, she said. Nobody gets to put a sticky note on it. Nobody gets to lock it up. It's yours. I sat on the edge of that bed and wept the way I hadn't let myself weep since the day I found a leaner in her chair by the window. She's the only one who ever really saw me, I thought, sitting there while my daughter, the one nobody had ever bragged about at church, unpacked groceries onto a windowsill shelf like it was the most ordinary thing in the world to save your own father from starving quietly in her brother's house. I had no idea, sitting there that Thursday evening, just how much that shelf of groceries was about to matter. I had no idea what was still sitting, unopened, in a filing cabinet in a storage unit. I'd nearly forgotten I still paid $22 a month for, a leftover piece of Alina's old pension fight from years before she died. But that's still ahead of us. Let me tell you what those next several months looked like first, because you need to understand what my daughter kept giving before you'll understand what I did with what I found. Patricia came every single Thursday after that, rain or shine, sometimes straight from a double shift at the dental office still in her scrubs. And she never once, not one time in all those months, brought up the money or asked when I might be able to pay her back, or made me feel the debt of it in any way at all. She'd sit with me on the edge of that bed some evenings, both of us eating fig preserves on crackers like it was the finest meal in the world, and she'd tell me about her day, the patients who tipped well at Christmas, the landlord who still hadn't fixed her water heater, small ordinary things that felt in that house like the only real conversation I had all week. One Thursday in early autumn she showed up later than usual, close to 9, still in her scrubs, and I could see right away something in her posture was different, tighter, like she was carrying something heavier than the grocery bags in her hands. "Sorry I'm late, Dad," one of the hygienists called in and I stayed to cover. She unpacked the bags in her usual quiet way, and it was only after she'd arranged everything on my little shelf, straightened the cans so the labels all faced the same direction the way she always did, that I noticed her own hands were shaking slightly. "Patricia, honey, sit down a minute." "What's wrong?" "Nothing, Dad, I'm just tired. I know my own daughter better than that." I made her sit on the edge of the bed with me, and it came out slow, the way things always came out of Patricia, reluctant, like she was afraid of adding one more weight to a room that already had enough of them. Her car had needed a new alternator that week, $400 she didn't have, and she put the repair on a credit card with an interest rate she was embarrassed to say out loud, on top of the groceries, on top of rent that had gone up $60 that month with no warning from her landlord. "Then don't come this week," I told her, my chest tight with something between gratitude and something closer to grief. "I mean it, Patricia. I'll manage. I don't want you choosing between your car and my groceries." She looked at me then with an expression I'd seen on her face since she was a little girl, stubborn and steady all at once. "I'm not choosing anything, Dad. I'm doing both. I always do both. That's just how it works." Another evening, closer to the holidays, she arrived with a rotisserie chicken still warm from the store, said she'd splurged because she wanted me to have one good hot meal that week instead of another week of canned soup and crackers. And she sat with me on the floor of my room, plates balanced on our knees because there wasn't a proper table up there. And we ate together and watched an old ball game on my little television. And for that one evening, the lock downstairs and the sticky notes and the careful math of what I was and wasn't allowed simply didn't exist at all. It's one of the finest meals I've had in my whole life, sitting cross-legged on a borrowed bedroom floor with my daughter, eating a $9 rotisserie chicken like it was a feast set for royalty. Bradley, meanwhile, grew quieter around me, not colder exactly, just increasingly absent, the way a man gets when he's decided a problem is easier to live beside than to actually solve. He'd nod at me in the hallway. He'd ask some evenings how I was feeling, in the flat tone of a man checking a box rather than a son checking on his father. "Vanessa kept the lock on the pantry the entire time. I want you to understand that. Even after the hospital, even after Dr. Osai's chart full of numbers that should have frightened any decent person in that house. The lock stayed exactly where it was, and the sticky notes kept appearing, and the words kept coming. 'This food is mine, not yours, Harold,' delivered in that same clipped, distant tone, like I was a stranger who'd wandered into her kitchen instead of the father of the man she'd married. There was one evening, close to Christmas, when Vanessa hosted her book club downstairs. 6 women I could hear laughing over wine 2 floors below while I sat upstairs with a can of soup I'd heated in the small microwave Patricia had bought me for exactly this purpose, because I wasn't invited down and hadn't been asked whether I wanted a plate of whatever spread Vanessa had put out for her friends. I heard her voice carry up the stairwell at one point, bright and warm, in a way I never once heard her use with me, telling her friends how blessed she felt to have such a full, generous life. I sat very still on the edge of my bed with my can of soup and thought about the word generous, and what it must mean to a woman who could use it about herself with a straight face, while a combination lock sat 2 floors below on a pantry door in front of her own father-in-law. That's the difference, I thought. watching Patricia refill my little windowsill shelf one more Thursday evening, tired lines under her eyes that hadn't been there a year before. Bradley gives when it's convenient and stops the second it isn't. Patricia gives because she doesn't know how to do anything else, doesn't even seem to register it as sacrifice, just as something you do for your father, plain and simple, no accounting kept. It was a Tuesday, 14 months into living in that house, when I finally called the storage facility to ask them to hold my unit one more month, because I was 3 payments behind and too proud to tell anybody, even Patricia, that I couldn't scrape together $22. The woman on the phone was kind about it, said she'd note the account, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that there'd been mail forwarded to that unit's address for months now, since I hadn't updated anything with the post office after the foreclosure. Certified mail, she said. Might want to come get it before it gets returned to sender. I drove out there myself, Patricia's old grocery bags folded flat in my trunk out of habit, and found a small stack of envelopes wedged in the unit's mail slot. Most of it was nothing, catalogs, expired coupons. But near the bottom was an envelope from a law firm in Columbus, Prescott and Hale, and beneath it, a second one from a pension litigation administrator I didn't recognize at first. Here we go, I thought. Another form letter about Alina's old pension dispute, the one the school district's benefits administrator had been dragging through appeals for the better part of a decade after they tried to slash retiree benefits in a restructuring. The one I'd basically stopped following years ago because every letter before this one had said some version of nothing yet, still pending, no action needed. I almost set it on the passenger seat to open later. Something made me sit right there in that storage facility parking lot and tear it open instead. I read it twice, then a third time slower, because I didn't trust my own eyes. It turned out the class action against the district's benefits administrator, the one Alina had been part of as a named claimant before she died, had finally settled after 8 years of appeals. A jury finding the pension restructuring had violated federal protections for vested retirees. Alina's individual share, calculated off her 31 years of service, and the specific benefit cuts she'd have been owed, came to $2,100,000, payable to her named beneficiary. Me. I set that letter down on my lap like it might go off if I moved too fast. $2,100,000. I thought. And 6 months ago I was fainting in a hallway because I couldn't afford to eat past 6 in the evening in my own son's house. I looked around that storage unit, mostly empty now except for a few boxes of Alina's things I hadn't had the heart to go through, and my mind went straight to a windowsill shelf in a borrowed bedroom, stocked every single Thursday by a daughter who couldn't fully afford her own water heater repair. She's the one who kept me alive, I thought. Not this house. Not this family's good address. My daughter and a jar of fig preserves she couldn't really spare. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. If this story's got you sitting up a little straighter, that's exactly where you should be, because everything up to this point was just the setup. What I found next in a filing cabinet inside that same storage unit is the part neither of my children saw coming. I didn't call Bradley. I didn't call Vanessa. I want you to remember that because it matters for what comes later. I never hid this settlement. I simply didn't see one single reason to announce it to the 2 people who'd spent 14 months deciding how much food I was allowed to eat in a house I'd helped pay to move into. I called somebody else instead. An attorney named Grace Faulkner, referred to me years ago by Alina's old union rep, who'd helped me look over the reverse mortgage mess after the fact. Too late to save the house, but early enough that she still had my file. Grace, it's Harold Whitfield. I need you to walk me through something before we talk about this settlement letter. Back when I first moved in with Bradley and Vanessa, there was a document, something Vanessa's attorney had me sign about the house, protecting their equity in case I ever needed nursing care and Medicaid came looking at their assets. Do you remember that? I remember it very well, Grace said. I told you at the time I didn't love the structure of it, but it was within Vanessa's rights to protect the home she and Bradley owned together, And you signed it because you didn't want your presence there to ever put their equity at risk down the line. That's the one, I said. I need you to pull it, word for word. I need to know exactly what it says about any assets I might come into later on my own, separate from that house. Grace called back 2 hours later, papers shuffling on her. Harold, I'm going to read you the exact language. Harold Whitfield hereby waives, releases, and forever disclaims any present or future ownership interest, equitable claim, or right of contribution in and to the real property located at the Wexford Meadows address, and further affirms that any assets, income, settlements, or inheritances he receives from any source at any time shall remain his sole and separate property, unencumbered by any claim from Bradley or Vanessa Whitfield, and shall not be considered a household or shared resource for any purpose. It's actually remarkably clean language, Harold. Vanessa's attorney wanted it airtight in both directions, protecting the house from you and, as a mirror clause, protecting anything that was ever yours from being treated as theirs. Does that mean what I think it means, Grace? Does it mean this pension settlement is entirely mine, with no claim from either of them, no matter how large it turns out to be? It absolutely does, Grace said. That clause was drafted broadly on purpose to close off any argument in either direction. Vanessa's attorney built you a very tall fence, Harold. She just built it assuming it would only ever need to keep you out. I almost laughed, sitting there in that storage unit parking lot. Except nothing about it felt funny. It was Vanessa's idea, wasn't it, I said, wanting it airtight in both directions. It was, Grace confirmed. Bradley signed off on it without much comment, from what I recall. Vanessa's attorney was thorough, very thorough. I sat there in my car a long while, looking at that filing cabinet's worth of old Union paperwork stacked in cardboard boxes in the storage unit behind me, and for the first time in 14 months I felt something that wasn't shame, wasn't hunger, wasn't the small constant math of what I was and wasn't allowed to eat. It was clarity, plain and total. Grace, I want to move forward with this quietly. I don't want a single soul outside this call knowing until it's done. Not even Bradley, especially not Bradley, especially not Vanessa. I thought about that windowsill shelf, about fig preserves on crackers, about a daughter sleeping sideways in a hospital recliner in her coat. Draw up whatever needs drawing up. I want a trust established, irrevocable, and I wanted to buy a house outright. Not rent, not a deposit, a real house, sole beneficiary Patricia Whitfield. Grace didn't say anything for a second. All of it, Harold. The full 2.1, after my own care costs and a reserve for whatever comes later, yes. Every dollar left goes toward that trust in that house. Enough that my daughter never has to fold flat another grocery bag to save it for reuse because she can't afford new ones. I stopped. Had to. My throat had gone tight. She fed me every single Thursday for 14 months, Grace. Held my hand in a hospital chair overnight in her coat because she couldn't afford to check her own coat at the door. Never once made me feel like I owed her for it. Meanwhile, my son let his wife put a combination lock on a pantry in a house I helped buy, and told me to my face that maybe I should ask my broke daughter to contribute more. So no, I'm not splitting this down the middle for this. Fair already happened, Grace. Fair happened on a windowsill shelf in a borrowed bedroom, and only one of my children ever put anything on it. I hear you, Harold. I'll have the documents ready inside 2 weeks. One more thing, Grace. Don't put my name on the deed for the house we buy her. Trust owns it outright. I don't want there to be one single piece of this anybody can argue about later. I want it as airtight as the fence Vanessa's attorney built. Let's see how she likes standing on the other side of one for once. Airtight, Grace said. I understand completely. I hung up the phone and sat there a long while in that storage facility parking lot, listening to the hum of the highway nearby, thinking about a pantry with a gym locker lock on it 4 miles from where I was sitting. They're going to find out eventually, I thought. And when they do, they're not going to come asking how I'm healing or whether I've been eating enough. They're going to come asking about money. That's just who they've let themselves become. Maybe who they've always been, and I simply didn't let myself see it clearly until I had nothing left to lose by looking. I wasn't wrong about that part. I want you to hold on to that thought because it's exactly what happened, but not the way I expected, and not for the reason I expected. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, that tells me something about the kind of person you are, and I think you're going to want to see how Vanessa finds out. Because she doesn't find out from me. She finds out the way I always suspected she would, chasing something she'd already convinced herself belonged, at least in part, to her. 11 days after that call with Grace, Bradley knocked on my bedroom door at 9 in the evening, later than he usually came up, and I could see something tight and unfamiliar in his face before he'd said a single word. "Dad, I need you to explain something to me." "Explain what, Bradley?" "Vanessa was going through some mail that got mixed up with ours downstairs, an old forwarding thing from the storage facility." He said it slow, like it hurt him to get the words out. "There was a copy of a settlement letter, Dad. $2 million. When were you going to tell us?" "So that's how it happened," I thought. Not from me. From an envelope his own wife had opened that wasn't addressed to her, digging through mail that wasn't hers the same easy way she'd decided, 14 months ago, that a locked pantry was hers to guard against her own father-in-law. I looked at the little windowsill shelf across the room, half-stocked still with things Patricia had brought 2 Thursdays before, and I felt that clarity again, steady and cold, and entirely without doubt. "I found out about that settlement 11 days ago, Bradley. 14 months after your wife put a lock on a pantry in a house I helped you buy. 6 months after I fainted in your hallway from not eating enough, and you came up to explain that maybe your sister should be con—" "That's different, Dad. That's business. This is family, this is." "It's exactly the same," I said, cutting him off, maybe for the first time in his adult life. "You made it very clear in that kitchen exactly how much space I was allowed to take up in this family. I'm just letting you know how much space you've got left in mine." There was a silence on the other side of that sentence that told me he hadn't expected an answer like that from me, hadn't prepared himself for a version of his father who didn't apologize first out of habit, the way I'd apologized in that house for 14 straight months just for needing to eat. 15 minutes later I heard the front door downstairs, then Vanessa's voice, sharper than I'd ever heard it, carrying all the way up the staircase. "Harold, we need to talk." She came up those stairs without knocking, the way people only do in a house they think of as entirely theirs. Though this time it wasn't even her own house she was walking into. It was the room she'd let me have, and then spent 14 months making sure I understood exactly how little of it was truly mine. $2 million, Vanessa said, standing in my doorway, still in her work blazer, color high in her cheeks. "And you're just going to sit up here with your little shelf of groceries like nothing happened." Neither of them asked how my hip was healing. Not one word about the fainting, the 14 months, the sticky notes, the lock. Straight to the number, same as it had always been in that house. "Sit down, Bradley," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "You both look like you're about to say something you won't be able to take back, and this room has had enough of that already." Vanessa didn't sit. She stood there with her arms crossed, the same stance she used to take in front of that pantry door. "That settlement is family money, Harold, retirement security, and you were going to keep it from us." I looked at her for a long moment before I answered. "I already did something with it," I said. 2 weeks ago." "It's done, done," Bradley repeated, and something shifted in his face, the beginning of an understanding he wasn't ready to hold yet. "What does done mean, Dad?" "I want you both to sit down first," I said. "Because what I'm about to tell you touches a document your own attorney drew up, Vanessa, back when I first moved in. And I think, once you hear it, you're going to understand exactly why none of that settlement was ever going to be something either of you could argue about." Vanessa's arms stayed crossed, but something underneath the certainty in her face had already started quietly to crack. Bradley finally sat down at the small chair by my window, the one Patricia usually sat in on Thursdays, and I could see him working something through, his jaw tight the way it used to get as a boy when a math problem wasn't coming out the way he expected. "What document, Dad?" he asked. "What are you talking about?" "The one your wife had me sign the month I moved in," I said. "Protecting the house, protecting your equity. in case I ever needed nursing care down the line and Medicaid came looking at what you two owned. You remember me signing it?" "Of course I remember," Vanessa said, though something in the set of her mouth told me she hadn't actually thought about that piece of paper in a long while, hadn't imagined it as anything other than a formality her own attorney had handled correctly on her behalf. "That protected our home, Harold. It had nothing to do with anything you might come into on your own." "That's not entirely true," I said. "It protected the house, yes. But the language your attorney chose didn't stop there. It said any assets I ever received from any source at any time would remain entirely mine, unencumbered by any claim from either of you, and would never be considered a shared household resource for any purpose. Your attorney wanted it airtight in both directions, Vanessa. Protecting the house from me, and protecting anything that was ever mine from ever being treated as yours. She got exactly what she asked for. Neither one of you ever once considered what it would mean if something like this happened." The color that had been high in Vanessa's cheeks a moment before had drained out almost entirely now, replaced by something tight and calculating. The look of a woman doing rapid math she badly wanted to come out differently than it was going to. "That's not what that document was for," she said, her voice climbing slightly. "That's not fair, Harold. That clause was standard boilerplate. My attorney includes that in every—" "It's fair," I said, cutting her off, calm in a way that surprised even me. "It's exactly as fair as a combination lock on a pantry door, Vanessa. You built a fence to keep me out of what was yours. I'm simply telling you the same fence keeps you out of what's mine." Bradley looked between the two of us, and I watched something pass across his face that might have been the beginning of shame, or might only have been the shock of watching $2 million slip permanently out of reach in the space of a single conversation. "So what did you do with it, Dad?" he finally asked, quieter now, some of his wife's sharpness noticeably absent from his own voice. "I set up an irrevocable trust," I said. 11 days ago. It's going to buy a house outright. Not a rental, not a deposit towards something bigger someday. A real house paid for in full, no mortgage, nothing anybody can ever come take away over a missed clause in a contract she didn't fully understand when she signed it. "Whose name is on it?" Bradley asked, though I could see in his face he already knew the answer before I gave it to him. "Patricia," I said. "Every dollar after my own care costs are set aside. Sole beneficiary." The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence I could remember in that house, longer than the silence after Dr. Osai's diagnosis, longer than the silence the first time I'd seen that lock on the pantry door and hadn't yet understood what it meant for the rest of my time there. Vanessa stood very still, some old comfortable understanding of her own household clearly coming apart in her hands in real time. Bradley stared at a spot on the carpet between his shoes, working through arithmetic that must have felt very different from anything he'd calculated at his own job. "You didn't even ask us," Bradley finally said, and there was something almost childlike underneath it, some small wounded piece of him surfacing through all the flatness of the last 2 years. "You just decided, without talking to either of us first." I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "I called out to you plenty of times over 14 months, Bradley. Every time I stood in that kitchen asking permission to eat something in my own son's house. You didn't hear any of those calls either. I didn't decide anything without talking to you. I decided after you'd already answered over and over in the smallest ways for 14 months straight." Vanessa found her voice again, sharper now, closer to panic than anger. "This isn't right, Harold. We took you in. We gave you a room, a roof, when you had nowhere else to go. You gave me a room with a lock on the pantry 2 doors down," I said, steady, not raising my voice at all because I didn't need to anymore. "Patricia offered me her own bedroom the same week you did, Vanessa. I chose yours because it looked like more. I found out inside of 6 months exactly how much less it actually was." Bradley put his face in his hands for a moment, and when he looked up there was something wet at the corner of his eyes that I hadn't seen from him since he was a boy. "Dad, I didn't know it had gotten that bad. I swear I didn't know you were skipping meals. You didn't know because you never once asked," I said, and my own voice caught slightly on that sentence, the only moment in the whole conversation where the calm nearly slipped. I fainted in your hallway, Bradley. Cracked my hip against a table 4 feet from your bedroom door. And the first thing your wife asked me wasn't whether I was hurt. It was whether I'd been taking my vitamins. Nobody said anything for a long moment after that. Vanessa's arms had finally uncrossed, hanging loose and uncertain at her sides, and something in her face had shifted from outrage into something closer to the beginning of understanding what the last 14 months had actually looked like from where I'd been standing the whole time. That's where I'm going to leave this for now. Because what I told them next, standing in that borrowed room with a windowsill shelf of groceries, my daughter had stocked with money she couldn't spare, and what Vanessa's own carefully worded fence had already decided 14 months before either of them knew there'd be anything worth fighting over. That's a conversation that changed every single thing about who actually had a place left in this family, and who was about to find out exactly how airtight their own paperwork could be. Stay with me. Part 2 picks up exactly where this one stops, standing in that doorway, and it does not go the way either of them expected.